Parker.
Mr Speaker, can I begin by responding to the comments by Rahui Katane that she wished that this House could do more to eliminate poverty in families. Rahui Katane sits with the Maori Party and voted for a budget this year that increased the gap between the rich and the poor by having income taxes, 35% of which go to the top 5% of income earners. So please, Ms Katane, don't preach to others in this House about those that are less well off and vote for a budget that increases the gap between the rich and the poor. Can I say that I agreed with some of the things that Russell Norman said about how what we are dealing with here is actually a reaction to some over-deregulation in different parts of the economy. And he mentioned that there had been over-deregulation in a number of spheres, and there are some obvious examples. Obviously, the building industry. We over-deregulated the building industry, and we caused billions of dollars of cost to ordinary New Zealanders through leaky homes, which were in large part an outcome of over-deregulation of the building industry. Then we also had over-deregulation of the electricity industry, and I'm reminded of the comments that we heard from John Carter in respect to the last bill, where he had the temerity to assert that there had been underinvestment in transmission because of what the last government did, the last Labor government did. I actually put on record, Mr John Carter, the Honourable John Carter, you actually got that exactly wrong. What happened was that Mr Bradford so deregulated electricity transmission that they actually had a written agreement between Transpower, who owns the national grid, that said that Transpower could only ever invest in the grid and get paid for it if the people who were paying their bills agreed to the upgrade. That was a written document prepared by the Treasury under Max Bradford's national government. And of course what happened was that Contact Energy and Meridian and the others could never agree on any upgrades, and so there were none done. And so by the end of the 1990s, transmission expenditure had dropped to between 20 and $50 million per annum, which was woefully inadequate. The Labor government then came in and said, look, this is nonsense. We actually need to have a regulator actually having some oversight of some planned investment in transmission infrastructure, and actually the amount in transmission spending following that change increased more than tenfold to more than $500 million per annum under the Labor government, including some massive projects that were approved for the upgrade of the Cook Strait cable, the transmission upgrade through the Waikato, some big upgrades in the Northern South Island, and the upgrade to some upgrades in Auckland. So, Mr Carter, far from that being proof that the national government does well and Labor does poorly, history shows the opposite. In terms of these particular bills which impose more regulation in respect to the finance sector, I agree they are necessary. But what I don't think that they do is they absolve the need to actually have a good look at what has already gone wrong. 61 finance companies, I'm told, have gone broke in the last 4 years. 61 finance companies. The biggest of those is the recent failure, or the biggest of the recent failures has been South Canterbury Finance. We heard the Honourable Bill English a couple of weeks ago in the ministerial statement say that most of what had gone wrong in South Canterbury Finance was a consequence of lending prior to the date of the first guarantee. Well, he says that's the case, and it may be the case, but we don't know until we look into it. And the reason I raise this is it seems to me that if there was shonky lending before that time of the grant of the first guarantee, we need to know what was known by whom and when. Because the purpose of the Crown Guarantee wasn't to prop up already insolvent institutions. The purpose of the Crown Guarantee was to give investors confidence that already sound institutions would not fail as a consequence of a run on the fund. That's why we did it in favour of the banks, and that's why we also did it in favour of the finance companies. Now, if the Honourable Bill English is correct, that at the time of the original guarantee, effectively South Canterbury Finance were already broke, then someone has gone wrong. Someone has gone wrong, and I don't know who that somebody is, which is why we need an inquiry. Was it the statutory trustee? There is a statutory trustee for every finance company. They have a statutory duty to oversee the terms of the debenture trust deed and make sure that the finance company is operating in the terms of their legal mandate set out in the trust deed. I don't know. There may be some fault by the trustee, and if there is, they should share the pain that currently is being borne totally by taxpayers, having bailed out $1.6 billion. Is that the figure, Mr. Cunliffe? $1.75 billion to depositors to South Canterbury Finance. So maybe the trustees should be bearing some scrutiny as to whether they have some liability. Perhaps it was the auditors. Did the auditors do their job properly in respect of South Canterbury Finance? I'm not sure. I find it hard to believe that if the Honourable Bill English is right, and I've got no reason to doubt his word, that the bad lending had already taken place and the state of South Canterbury Finance was already powerless effectively at the time of the original guarantee. Did the auditor do their job properly? If they knew that, I don't think the Honourable Bill English would have signed it in, to be fair, Mr. Cunliffe. But maybe there was some misrepresentation of the position by the auditor, or that the auditor is responsible for. What about the directors? Did the directors of South Canterbury Finance have knowledge as to how powerless their loan book was? Because if they did, that ought to have been disclosed to the Crown. It ought to have been disclosed to depositors too. But it certainly ought to have been disclosed to the Crown at the time of the guarantee. There is a $1.75 billion loss being suffered by taxpayers as a consequence of this bailout, and we need to find out what's gone wrong. We really need to find what's gone wrong. Now, one of the other problems that we've had in a lot of finance companies is that there have been far too many cosy deals between the directors and family interests of the directors, including their family trusts and friends of theirs, and loans that were not appropriately secured. And we've seen that in Hanover. We've seen that in a lot of the other finance companies where there was related party lending and there were loans being given by companies under the control of directors to entities that are related to those directors. And in my opinion, this has been one of the greatest failures by the regulators, because in some of those transactions, those directors, they had prior form from the 1980s clean out. And if the regulators can't keep an eye on the people who had prior form, and if the trustees can't, and if the auditors can't, why do we have them? If they can't keep an eye on the people who had prior criminal form sometimes, and these directors come back in a later incarnation, there is something wrong with our system. And I suspect that some of the things that have gone wrong in South Canterbury Finance could include related party loans. Loans to organisations controlled by some of the directors in instances where they didn't take appropriately guarantees from the family trusts. So what happens is that the benefit of the transaction accrues to the family trust, but there is no to some entity related to the director to improve the wealth of the number of companies or family trusts that these people have an interest in, and yet the risk actually isn't attached to those assets, despite the fact that the directors of those companies knew where the assets were and knew where those guarantees should have been taken from. And I am not convinced that there are not tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in that category, not just in the case of South Canterbury Finance, but in respect of some of these other finance companies. So, Mr. Speaker, this bill is supported by the Labor Party, but more than anything else, we need an inquiry into these finance companies, in particular into South Canterbury Finance, as to what's gone wrong there. Why is it that there is no willingness to have an inquiry when there has been $1.75 billion of taxpayer money lost? If this cost $1 million, this inquiry, it would be 1,750th of the loss. Not 1%, not a tenth of 1% of the loss, even less than that. Mr. Speaker, we must get this in perspective. A $1.7 billion loss to taxpayers. We need to find out what's gone wrong. I'm not suggesting Malafides on the part of the Honourable Bill English, but something rotten